Tsunesaburo Makiguchi was born in 1871, at a time when Japan was embarking on the process of modernization, following its first encounter with the West. Throughout his life, Makiguchi continued to speak out, even as the forces of Japanese nationalism and militarism gained strength, refusing to succumb to their influence. As a geographer and educator, and finally as a religious thinker, what was it that drove Makiguchi in his consistent quest? Tsunesaburo Makiguchi was born in Kashiwazaki in present-day Niigata Prefecture on June 6, 1871. His father is thought to have been a seaman, but he abandoned the family. When his mother Ine remarried, he was adopted at the age of 5 by Zendayu Makiguchi, an uncle. At the age of 14, Makiguchi moved to Otaru on the island of Hokkaido. Hokkaido was a new frontier at the time, and communications were by sea, mainly following the trade routes from Osaka in the west of Japan along the Japan Sea coast past Niigata. Otaru was a rapidly growing harbor town, already one of the most important ports in Hokkaido. With stone warehouses and Western-style brick buildings, Otaru was in many ways a model town for Japan's modernization project. Makiguchi's first job is thought to have been as an errand boy in the local Otaru police department. Then, in 1889, he enrolled in the Hokkaido Teachers Training College in Sapporo. Sapporo was then, as now, the capital of Hokkaido. This period in Japan's history is known as the Meiji period, a time when scholars and advisors from the West were contributing to the modernization of Japan after its long isolation from the world. The agricultural college near Makiguchi's school was a center for the influx of new knowledge from the West. Hokkaido Teachers Training College was the only school in Hokkaido for the training of elementary school teachers, and as a result, was able to enroll the most academically gifted students. All the students were boarders, with tuition and fees entirely covered by the state. The primary aim of the Minister of Education at the time, Arinori Mori, was to mobilize the next generation of Japanese toward the goal of industrial wealth and military strength. And as such, he placed special importance on the teacher training system.
When the school system was established in the Meiji period, 3 elements were stressed in compulsory education: language, history, and geography. These days, what we call Japanese is understood throughout Japan, but achieving this first meant encouraging the use of a standardized form. Next was history, which planted in people's minds the idea of a shared past. Finally, the study of geography reinforced the idea that we occupy a unified national territory. Together, these subjects help forge a sense of national identity. In this way, the word geography came into everyday use. And today there isn't a Japanese person who wouldn't understand it.
Tsunesaburo Makiguchi graduated from Hokkaido Teachers Training College at the age of 21, becoming a teacher at the attached elementary school. He later recalled his first experience as a trainee teacher. It was the first time I'd ever stood in front of a class. I remember being extremely nervous. I still break out in a sweat just to remember my anxiety at the time, amazed that the children actually listened to what I said. The hardest thing was teaching composition to a class of girls in the 5th grade. When I asked them to write something, all the majority of them did was chew on their pencils. As an experiment, Makiguchi showed his students how to write an essay about the Shinkawa River, one of the rivers running through the city. Shinkawa was a man-made river carved out in 1871 for agricultural irrigation. Next, they wrote an essay together on the Sosegawa River, another artificial waterway laid down earlier in the century to provide drinking water for the local people. Finally, he assigned the students to write about the Toyohidagawa River, which, unlike the 2 other waterways, was a natural river. When the children had learned how to describe the local rivers, Makiguchi next had them write about mountains. This teaching method of working from the familiar and close at hand and steadily incorporating new and less familiar material was to remain the basis of Makiguchi's educational philosophy from that time onwards. It was at the same time his way of encouraging children to think about their relationship with the natural environment. At the time, apart from the most prosperous of families, almost all children were expected to help their parents out to the best of their abilities. What their parents wanted was for them to grow up as quickly as possible and shoulder a full share of the family's labor. It isn't clear exactly when Makiguchi started to question the teaching methods in which he had been trained at college, namely the rote memorization of classwork. But from his early years as a teacher, he was constantly seeking ways to encourage children to think, decide, and act independently. Makiguchi started to share his ideas about teaching methods with others. He wrote several columns for a local newspaper on teaching methodology, exploring questions such as how to motivate children to study. The goal of education is to stimulate interest. How do children learn? They learn not by being forced to do so, but from taking interest in the subject matter. Rather than the provision of knowledge itself, the goal is to encourage the joy and excitement that arises from learning. Rather than passively absorbing knowledge, Makiguchi stressed the importance of learning to learn. What is the best way to inspire children to develop their interests? Makiguchi started to experiment with various methods in the geography classes to which he was assigned. He believed that rather than simply memorizing the names of mountains and rivers, cities and towns, we should think about how these relate to our lives. This can provide the impetus for each of us to think about and become engaged with the world around us. Makiguchi started writing a geography textbook applying his experience as a teacher. While teaching at the elementary school, Makiguchi sat the difficult Ministry of Education license examination, enabling him to start teaching at the Teachers Training College. By 1900, he had become a key member of the Association for Education in Hokkaido, even though he was only 28 years old. Nevertheless, a year later, Makiguchi and his wife, Kuma, whom he had married 5 years earlier, and their 2 young children set out by boat from Otaru to Tokyo. Makiguchi's purpose was to complete and publish his work, The Geography of Human Life. He already had an extensive manuscript in hand. Recently discovered documents revealed that Makiguchi was actively looking for an academic mentor. One such person was the geographer Shigetaka Shiga. Shiga was a graduate of the Agricultural College in Hokkaido. He later became a professor of geography at what is now Waseda University in Tokyo. His celebrated work, Japanese Landscape, offered poetic descriptions that sought to arouse in the Japanese people a sense of pride and appreciation for their homeland. Shiga contributed a foreword to the Geography of Human Life, Makiguchi's first work, which was published in 1903. The Geography of Human Life received favorable reviews from numerous leading newspapers and periodicals of the time. Takuji Ogawa, a well-known geologist and geographer, reviewed Makiguchi's book. It is impossible not to be astonished at the earnest research efforts of the author of this 1,000-page work, by the extent of his reading, the novelty and freshness of his ideas, and by the aptness of his arguments. Ogawa would later become a professor of Kyoto University, and his son would become Japan's first Nobel laureate.
Tsunesaburo Makiguchi's book, The Geography of Human Life, was published in 1903. Even now, the phrase geography of human life is hard to grasp, and as a book title, it was certainly unusual at the time. Makiguchi chose this title because he wanted to first focus on the activities of human life and consider the meaning of nature from that perspective. Of course, nature is crucial to the study of geography. Makiguchi approached the study of nature through the activities of human beings. Through the interrelationship between human activities and the physical environment, and how this relationship will differ according to the time and place. I think Makiguchi called his book The Geography of Human Life for these reasons, but it's important to note that when he speaks of human life, he's referring to concrete life activities and not to some abstract philosophical idea. At the time, it was the most detailed overview of geography written from this perspective in Japan. Let's take a look at what it says. In the introduction, Makiguchi writes that to observe the way people live, start with the immediate and familiar. What you see around you, with the local community. Community may refer to the whole of Japan, or to the small village in which you live. The scope of one's community is something which we humans are able to decide and define for ourselves. Makiguchi writes that one has to start by observing the familiar, the experiential. In Part 1, Makiguchi discusses differences between the places in which people live. Then, in Part 2, he examines the meaning of the relationship between land and people, the interactions between nature and humankind. Here, too, rather than adopting what might be called a deterministic stance, that the way people live is inevitably determined by the environment, he takes the view that it is human beings that give meaning to nature. Finally, in Part 3, he speaks of the earth as the stage or setting for human life. This is something that at the time was probably not considered part of geography, but which today is examined in theories of economic or political geography. He was examining the question of how economic activity changes depending on the location, and what rules or principles guide that. And back then, political geography was concerned mainly with questions such as whether a country's borders were defined by mountains or by rivers. In this sense, Part 3 of the Geography of Human Life was groundbreaking. Makiguchi's book is currently attracting the attention of many Japanese geographers, and from a contemporary point of view, it is this third part that contains the most original ideas.
The Geography of Human Life was published 4 months before the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War. At the time, most politicians and intellectuals were vociferously calling for war. But the geography of human life was different. It appealed for peaceful coexistence between nations.
If you look at Chapter 13 of the Geography of Human Life, Oceans, Makiguchi asserts quite clearly the need to take a universal view of things. He talks about how Japan is a country without resources and how it is challenged to become a truly viable state. He uses a very clever metaphor, comparing the nation of Japan to a store or a shop. The small country that spans latitude 21 degrees to 51 degrees north and longitude 120 degrees to 156 degrees east is the location of a rather run-down shop. The Japanese people sit in the storefront warming themselves by the fire, smoking tobacco and waiting for customers. Japan is a nation of 40 million store clerks. A silk or tea or dry goods shop with a cherry blossom mark over the entryway. We've now set up shop as a car dealer, a camera shop, an electronics store. People from overseas buy all these products from us, and we receive dollars or pounds in return. Makiguchi's concern was, what can we actually do to make this resource-poor Japan a happier place? It was clear to Makiguchi that any country that wages war will fall into penury. So if we avoid war, it would be better for everyone. We can, in the once popular phrase, ensure everyone has a full stomach. I think throughout his book, Makiguchi is warning hungry Japanese impatient for war not to go there.
On arriving in Tokyo, Makiguchi became the editor of an educational periodical and also worked in the field of correspondence courses designed for women. Correspondence education played a vital role if women were to learn about the world so they could achieve the independence they needed with their fathers and young husbands caught up in the war. Also around this time, Makiguchi was teaching geography at Kobun College, an institute for visiting Chinese exchange students. His classes were directly based on the ideas in The Geography of Human Life. He always derived his theories and methods from actual classroom experience, applying and testing these again in the classroom setting. This was his consistent approach throughout his career as an educator. After returning to China, some of the graduates of Kobun College published a Chinese language version of the Geography of Human Life based on their classroom notes. In 1910, the Ministry of Education employed Makiguchi as an editor producing officially accredited geography textbooks. But what the ministry commissioned were geography textbooks for rote memorization, which was completely different from the aims of the geography of human life. At around the time he was working at the Ministry of Education, Makiguchi started attending the monthly meetings of a cross-disciplinary research group held at the home of the educator and internationalist Inazo Nitobe. These study meetings were held in a relaxed format and were attended by researchers presenting papers on a wide variety of topics. One of the core members of this group was Kunio Yanagita, considered the founder of Japanese folklore studies. Nitobe had graduated from the Agricultural College in Sapporo, and although he had experience as a university teacher and high school principal, he was now dedicated to the cause of international peace, considering himself less a Japanese national than an international citizen. He would later become an Under-Secretary General of the League of Nations. Makiguchi's second publication was Research in Community Studies. The work suggested that community studies, the study of the immediate and familiar, should be the basis and focus of classroom instruction. What he was trying to emphasize was that the important thing for students is not the rote memorization of textbooks, but to come to their own understanding of the relationship between their lives and the world through direct observation of their immediate surroundings. The Taisho period was, in many cases, the first time the Japanese people became conscious of ideals such as liberty and equality, a time when the world seemed to be heading in a positive direction. The highest building in Tokyo was a 12-story tower in Asakusa. Other than that, there were just a few 5-story pagodas. During this period, Makiguchi spent 9 years as the principal of 4 different elementary schools in downtown Tokyo. He became principal of Tosei Elementary School in 1913. His name remains on the staff list of the time. The school provided evening classes, and the graduation registers include details of the children's daytime jobs, such as babysitters, apprentices, factory workers, textiles workers. Coming from impoverished families, children were expected to provide whatever labor they could. What should the role of education be in helping these children and their parents achieve some measure of happiness? Makiguchi, as he applied himself in the classroom, was constantly aware of the irrationality and inequality of society. While serving as principal of Taisho Elementary School, Makiguchi refused to give preferential treatment to the child of a powerful family. The student's father mobilized a local politician to campaign for the expulsion of Makiguchi. He was transferred to a new school, Nishimachi Elementary School, but the politician whose influence dominated the area continued to press for Makiguchi's dismissal. It was at this time that Makiguchi was first visited by Jinichi Toda, who later became known as Josei Toda. Feeling Toda's deep commitment to the field of education, Makiguchi employed him as a temporary substitute teacher. From that time forward, Toda became a follower of Makiguchi's educational theories, with the closest understanding of any of Makiguchi's disciples. Makiguchi's supporters among the students' families and his fellow staff campaigned hard to keep him in office, and the students themselves staged a boycott in his support. But in the end, he was forced to resign. Later, as principal of Mikasa Elementary School, Makiguchi organized a campaign to provide food for poor students. The students were given bread and a couple of bowls of soup. Makiguchi appealed to the more prosperous residents to contribute toward the cost. Mikasa was located in the region to the east of the Sumidagawa River, one of the major waterways running through downtown Tokyo. In 1922, Makiguchi became the principal of Shirokane Elementary School in what is now Minato Ward in Tokyo. Makiguchi was 50 years old at the time. Throughout his years as a principal, he had been diligently recording the results of applying his educational theories, At Shirokane, his educational theory and practice reached its most complete form. Toda was 22 at this time. He decided to resign as a classroom teacher and instead set up a private school, the Jishu Gakkan. Although its purpose was to prepare children to sit exams, Toda created an unrestrained atmosphere in which Makiguchi's educational theories could be applied in the wider world. On September 1st, 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake struck Tokyo, killing around 100,000 people and causing cataclysmic damage to the capital. While many died in the earthquake itself, many more were incinerated by the fires that swept through the city. Makiguchi, together with his pupils, collected relief supplies such as clothing and blankets, pots and pans, and distributed them to the victims of the disaster. In the panic following the earthquake, rumors spread that Koreans living in the city were rioting. Bands of vigilantes roamed the city, slaughtering large numbers of innocent Koreans and Chinese. In 1925, the government passed the Universal Suffrage Law and the Peace Preservation Law, the latter aimed initially at suppressing the communist movement in Japan. The law was subsequently revised in 1928 and 1941, such that in the end, anyone opposing Japan's military policies was designated a thought criminal. 1926 saw the start of the Showa period. The mood of the new era was presaged by the words of the iconic writer Ryunosuke Akutagawa, whose suicide note referred to an undefinable sense of foreboding. The first general election under the new universal suffrage law was held in February 1928. It was immediately followed by a severe police crackdown against leftists under the Peace Preservation Law. That June, the Peace Preservation Law was made more draconian through the application of the death penalty. This film, Sumidagawa River, was shot in 1930 by the Ministry of Education. It portrays life on the river that flows through downtown Tokyo. Large numbers of people lived and worked on barges on the river. Children would leave the barges to go to school. Unloading cargo took time, so it was often impossible for the barge to return to the appointed place to collect the children. It was time for Makiguchi to share with the world the fruits of more than 20 years of experience and thought. Between 1930 and 1934, he published The System of Value-Creating Pedagogy. The decision to make value-creating pedagogy the theme of this book reflects the intention to pursue an organized plan of education, one that is not satisfied with the partial education of force-feeding knowledge, but education whose goal is to guide learners to a life of happiness that brings together the total experience of value, the values of beauty, gain, and good. Cramming as a form of education can only result in students absorbing existing sets of values. What is important is that children become individuals capable of creating their own value. What is best for oneself, for society? What is useful? What is good? What is agreeable? How can each individual bring into being a prosperous society by making these decisions for themselves? These were the themes on which Makiguchi's pedagogy was based. In a preface, Inazo Nitobe wrote, "Your pedagogy of value creation is an educational theory born from a Japanese educator of the kind I have long hoped to see. And I believe that this is a work of excellence, for whose birth the people of our age have long desired." This photo shows a field trip Makiguchi led during his time as principal of Shirokane Elementary School. By this time, Shirokane had become one of the most renowned schools in Tokyo. Sadako Kaneko, who was later to marry Makiguchi's third son, Yozo, was once a pupil at Shirokane Elementary School.
In 1939, I went to the Makiguchi home as a new bride. In March of that year, Mr. Makiguchi, my father-in-law, started taking me to meetings. There he spoke of wanting to open a system of schools that would educate young people from the elementary level right through to university, based on the principles of value-creating education that he had been developing. He used to say that if this did not come to fruition in his lifetime, it certainly would be realized by his disciple, Josei Toda. Unfortunately, Mr. Toda was taken by illness before this came to pass. However, Mr. Toda's disciple, Daisaku Ikeda, did create this Soka, or value-creating school system, fulfilling Mr. Makiguchi's dream. Of course, Mr. Ikeda never met Mr. Makiguchi. Of course, he would have heard about Mr. Makiguchi's dream from Mr. Toda, and Mr. Ikeda has indeed established the Soka integrated education system in accordance with those wishes, covering all levels from elementary school right up to Soka University. I can just imagine Mr. Makiguchi smiling to see his ideas being put into practice at Soka University. He would have been so pleased. He truly would. He had such a lovely smile. Generally, Father used to look so stern, but when he smiled, it was really memorable.
In 1930, Makiguchi and Toda created the Soka Kyoiku Gakkai, or Value Creating Education Society, whose members were initially mainly educators and researchers. But as it developed to hold meetings around the country, the general public also started to participate. In this way, Makiguchi's field of activity expanded from the realm of education into all areas of everyday life. As the organization's activities developed, Makiguchi began to accord a greater importance to the teachings of Buddhism, especially those of Nichiren, to which Makiguchi and Toda had converted in 1928. The organization's activities expanded from a call for the reform of education to the reform of society as a whole. In this, there is a consistent commitment to peace throughout Makiguchi's work ever since the geography of human life. Makiguchi describes his beliefs in this way. Unless it is based on the essence of Buddhism, the trust and faith necessary to implement the value-creating educational method cannot be established, and we will not achieve educational reform. In which case, we could hold hundreds or even thousands of conferences, but not be able to realize world peace. By this time, Japan's invasion of China had begun. Japan's militarists were already declaring the emperor a living god, and were utilizing the theory of state Shintoism to tighten the grip of militarism over the country. In 1941, the Peace Preservation Law was amended once again, restricting the freedom of religion and tightening control over religious organizations. Although many Buddhist and Christian sects followed the directives of the government, Makiguchi appealed strongly for freedom of religion and made speeches to this effect throughout the country. The militarist government was, at the time, claiming the war with China was for the sake of peace in Asia. Makiguchi fiercely denounced this claim, demanding the people free themselves from the shrouds of militarist indoctrination. Soon, Makiguchi's activities came to the attention of the Special Higher Police, Japan's thought police. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, launching the Pacific War. But within a year, the Japanese army was in retreat. In July 1943, Tsunesaburo Makiguchi was detained in the city of Shimoda, in what is now Shizuoka Prefecture. The charges were violation of the peace preservation law and blasphemy, namely that his activities blasphemed the imperial family and associated Shinto shrines. Makiguchi was imprisoned in Tokyo's Sugamo prison when he was informed that his son Yozo had been killed in action in China. In a letter to his wife Kuma and daughter-in-law Sadako in October 1944, he wrote, "I was shocked and disheartened. Even more, though, I was worried about the two of you and how you must feel. I was greatly relieved to learn that you are both firm and determined. Sadako, it is so reassuring for me to know how well you are holding up. As for me, I'm fine. I'm studying Kant's philosophy. I've succeeded in developing a theory of value such as scholars for the past 100 years sought but could not realize. Further, I have linked this to the Lotus Sutra, and there are several thousand people demonstrating actual proof of its correctness. When I see this, I have to admit being astonished. It is thus only natural that the 3 obstacles and 4 devils should arise. It is just as the sutra states." Even in prison, Makiguchi never stopped studying, reading Kant and the Lotus Sutra. Where the letter mentions the 3 obstacles and 4 devils, it is referring to the Buddhist principle that when one practices correct teachings, obstacles and persecution will arise to hinder one. But this was to be Makiguchi's last letter. On November 18, 1944, Tsunesaburo Makiguchi died in Sugamo prison. He was 73. Japan surrendered 9 months later.
The interesting thing about studying Makiguchi is that through the Meiji years, the Taisho years, in fact, the same probably applies today. When it comes to Japanese public opinion, invariably about 70% of people hold the dominant view of the time, with the remaining 30 or maybe 20% taking the opposing view. So I imagine that at the time, there were people who were deeply disturbed by the fact that Japan was at war, people who opposed this. I doubt it was 30%, but probably 10 to 20% of the population thought that way. Makiguchi always had these people in mind, always placed himself on the side of the minority. What I'm trying to say is that since the Meiji period, there had always been these 2 opposing forces. Makiguchi consistently aligned himself with the minority view, and even more significantly, was always on the side of or allied with reason, with a logical and rational way of thinking. I think this is important. It shows he was striving to be free, to be fair, to be universal. In short, that a single school teacher did all this work is amazing to us today. It's an achievement of which we can all be proud.
Over the past 50 to 60 years, life in Japan has changed immeasurably. Our relationship with the environment has been completely transformed. The town where Makiguchi was born is now the site of a nuclear power plant. But the issues Makiguchi confronted and struggled with still face us today. In a preface to The System of Value-Creating Pedagogy, Makiguchi wrote, 10 million young people forced to endure the agonies of cutthroat competition, the difficulty of getting into good schools, the examination hell, and the struggle for jobs after graduation. I am driven almost to distraction by the need to prevent these miseries from afflicting the next generation. When I think of this, I cannot be distracted by the question of reputation, the random praise or censure of others. What Makiguchi sought was a society where every child could find happiness as a protagonist in the creation of value. Makiguchi's quest will not be over until such a society has been realized throughout Japan and throughout the world.